Great. Good afternoon, everybody. If you're here, I'm Peter Larson, the chair of the Ottawa Forum on Israel-Palestine. If you are here for the webinar on what's happening in Jerusalem and in Israel today with Jeff Halper, you're at the right spot. It's now 4 o'clock. We're going to start in just a minute or two. I see that people are registering, so I'll wait till we give people a chance to get logged in. Yeah. It looks like we've lost Jeff Halper, but we haven't really. I'm told he's just getting a coffee. Oh, Jeff is back here, so
playing with the lights.
That's great. I have again, I say my name is Peter Larson. I'm the chair of the Ottawa Forum on Israel-Palestine. I've asked Arthur Milner, who's on the advisory council of the Ottawa Forum, to help me carry on a conversation with Jeff. We're going to run this kind of as if it were a dinner conversation, as if I had been able to invite Jeff and Arthur over to my house for dinner, say what the heck is going on in Israel. And I have enabled the chat function, so anybody who wants to make comment, disagree, agree, emphasize, or even debate with each other on the chat function, please go ahead and do that. Feel free to do it. However, I'm only going to pay attention while the conversation is on to the Q&A function. So if you have some specific questions you want to ask, I will be watching the questions that come in. I'll try to pick up the ones, maybe fold 2 or 3 together, or whatever, to try to get as many of your concerns on as possible. And of course, this will be recorded, and a copy of the recording will be made available to everybody who's registered, whether or not they were able to attend today, and feel free to share that with other people. So let me just first of all introduce my 2 guests here. I'll start with Arthur Milner, who is a Canadian playwright, a Jewish Canadian playwright, born in Montreal, whose father was a very strong Zionist, and who I had the opportunity to travel around Israel with Arthur 15 years or so ago. Arthur and I have been friends for a very long time. And the other guest, of course, is Jeff Halper. Jeff is, I want to get a copy of your book to show, your most recent book to show, Jeff. I'll find that before you have it there to show. Okay, hold it up a little bit more. Decolonizing Israel, Liberating Palestine. I will. Okay, we see it. We see it. We can't see you anymore, but we see the cover of the book. I recommend it to anybody who's interested in the issue. It
also, by the way, came out in Arabic. If there's any Arabic-speaking people in the crowd.
Okay, well, there's. I think that's probably a minor component of my listening audience, but nonetheless, Jeff made Aliyah as an American Jew to Israel 50 years ago this year. Is that right, Jeff? I got the numbers right?
Yeah. 50 years ago last week.
Wow. And Jeff has been living in Jerusalem ever since. A number of people on this call will, of course, heard Jeff before. He's the founder of the Israeli Committee on House Demolitions. He also is a member of the One Democratic State campaign. And so he's talked to us a lot about the situation of Palestinians. But today, exceptionally, I'm going to ask Jeff, and Arthur's going to help me talk about what's going on inside Israel, as the debates that are going on inside Israel. And it's quite extraordinary. A lot of you will have seen, if you pay attention to this, Haaretz articles about Israeli doctors wanting to flee the country and find the work anywhere, about the rise in number of Israeli Jews looking for foreign passports, about talk about civil war, of course, the huge demonstrations. And this is the context in which we receive this information, but in Canada, it tends to get, in the mainstream press, interpreted a little bit differently. I was at dinner last night with a friend of mine who asked me if I was happy that Netanyahu was in the hospital or had been in the hospital having a heart attack. And of course, I'm not happy that anybody has a heart attack, but I took that what he meant behind that is he thought, like a lot of Canadians do, that the problem in Israel is Netanyahu. If we could just get rid of him, everything would go back to normal. And I'm pretty sure that's not the case, but that's what I want to talk to Jeff about today. So Jeff, welcome. Arthur, welcome. Thanks very much for joining us today.
Good to be with you all.
Jeff, you've just told me that it's 11 o'clock in Jerusalem. You've just come back from the gym, so you're drinking your coffee to keep awake. Thank you very much. Jeff, let me just ask you an interesting question. Both sides in this debate in Israel claim they're defending democracy. I'm not asking you to say you believe both arguments, but what's the basis on which Netanyahu and his crowd would say they're defending democracy, and those who are defending the Supreme Court and so on would say they're defending democracy?
Well, yeah, that's on the surface. That's a discussion. So the pro judicial reforms, they're called. Really, we call them more a coup rather than reforms here. But those that support them, with Netanyahu and his government and so on, I mean, it's not a good faith, sincere debate. What they're saying is the courts have too much power because the courts can overrule what the politicians, what the Knesset, the parliament decides, and the executive, and therefore there's an imbalance. You know, they can nullify the will of the voters. The voters elected a government, and the Supreme Court has too much power, and it won't allow the government to govern the way it should. Now, what they mean, of course, govern the way they should, is that the government has a free hand to do anything. You see, the problem is in Israel, you know, like in other democracies or sort of democracies, you know, you're supposed to have three branches of a government: the executive, the legislative, and the judicial. And there's some kind of a balance between them. Different countries have different systems. Israel does not have a constitution. So right away, there's no basic legal foundation, in a way, that all the three branches can kind of agree on. These are the rules of the game, you see. So that's one problem. And so and then, of course, the executive and the legislation are really one branch. You don't have a separate parliament, because the prime minister, who heads the executive branch, is the head of the largest political party, and he's the one that puts together the coalition. So it's his governing coalition that runs the parliament. 85% of the legislation passed by parliament is initiated in the government. So the parliament becomes a kind of a rubber stamp, you see. So in a sense, then, it means we have two branches of power, two branches of government. The executive and legislative are one, and then you have the Supreme Court. Now, the Supreme Court has authority. It's a court, and if Israel doesn't have a constitution, it does have a corpus of law, including some laws that are a little more stronger than others that we call basic laws. So there's a number of basic laws, which I guess in American terms would be like the Bill of Rights. They're not a constitution, but they have kind of the authority, let's say, of an amendment sort of to a constitution, you know? So, you know, and on that basis, where the rules of the game that do exist are within these basic laws, and then the other legislation, the Supreme Court then does what Supreme Courts do. And other courts, you know, they say what's legal and what's not.
Okay, all right.
So what the government wants to do then is to basically make one branch of government.
And what's the political, that's sort of a legal issue, but what do they want to do with the power that they have? How do they want to change Israeli society?
Well, okay, but yeah, no, but what I'm saying is that what they want to do is make basically one branch of government. They want to subordinate the courts, the judicial branch, to the other two.
But in order to do what?
And then you've got only one branch of government. Now,
Right.
Why do they want to do that? And this is common in countries all over the world. I mean, Hungary, Poland, Turkey, but also more and more in the United States and other places. because the right wing has an agenda that does not conform to international law or even to their own laws. In other words, they don't really want a democracy. They want, if you see what's happening in the U.S., for example, they want to be able to legislate no more separation of church and state. Or the government can do anything it wants to do in terms of racial issues, or in other words, human rights, international law, and all the principles of the Constitution are, in a sense, suspended in order that the government has. And this goes back to then what the government is saying. We have the right to rule. This is what they're saying. We have the right to rule because we've been elected by the people. You see, and the court should not be in a situation where it can hinder us in any way. And what's important to understand is that Israel's not alone in this. The Federalist Society in the United States has a worldwide plan. I wish the left was as organized as the right is. There's a coordinated plan. I'm sure the Federalist Society has its branch in Canada. Here it's called the Kohelet Institute. And they have, and they've been doing this for years, they have lists of judges that they're trying to get in, right-wing judges. They have a whole legislative, and this whole program that the Netanyahu's government is promoting the laws have been written by the Kohelet Institute based on the templates of the Federalist Society and the states and other neoliberal organizations. So this isn't only Israel.
Okay. Maybe I'll let Arthur ask a question, because otherwise you're going to do a speech for the whole time, Jeff. I know.
Yeah, but you haven't heard the
you have
other
so much
side,
we want to ask you.
No problem. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just would add the one thing one reads over and over again in these discussions is that we were elected and we have the right to do whatever we want, and that's democracy. And you won't let us do what we want, and that's not democracy. And you see that over and over again, which I guess is a problem of education, that kids in grade 3 should learn what democracy actually is, that voting is only the most basic part of it, a necessary part of it. Maybe you could tell us a bit what it's like on the ground there. Have you been going to demonstrations? Which ones? What does your sign say when you go?
I don't go to the demonstrations because we never had a chance to get into the other side, what the other side says, but maybe we'll get to that later. The problem is that Israel is not a democracy. Even without Netanyahu, without this whole judicial reform, it's not a democracy. We call it officially a Jewish democracy. So the minute you qualify, it's a Christian democracy, a white democracy, whatever you qualify it, it's not a democracy anymore. Because Israel is a Jewish state that belongs to one particular group in society, which is the Jews. So, the other side, that's trying to protect democracy, has co-opted the Israeli flag, for example. That's become the symbol. Everybody wraps themselves in the Israeli flag, so that, in order to say that the real Israel is a democracy. You see? Now, the whole issue of Palestinians, occupation, apartheid, what does it mean to be a Jewish state and privilege Jews over everyone else? All of that is completely out of the discussion. In other words, the other side, who are the liberals, who represent, this idea that Israel should be a liberal democracy, and that's what we're fighting for. They take Israel as kind of a self-contained entity. In other words, there's Israel, and Israel it should be a Jewish state, and it's somehow a liberal democracy, and it has an appendage that's an occupation. There happen to be 5 million Palestinians that we rule with no rights whatsoever, but that's another discussion. That isn't Israel. That's kind of on the other side. And that's not true, of course, for the side of Netanyahu, who does include those people as a part of Israel. But that's the idea of the left, that somehow you can isolate a liberal democratic Israel and save it and wrap yourself in its flag, and it has nothing to do with occupation or Palestinians, which is why I don't go to those demonstrations.
But isn't it true, Jeff, that, I mean, for Israelis, Israel has been a liberal democracy. I mean, you've been arrested, but you are able to continue to do your, it's not a fascist for Israel. There's quite a bit of liberty for Israeli Jews to say and do what they want, right? Is that they even put some prime ministers in jail and so on and so forth. So is it true that they're afraid that that kind of freedom may disappear with the new right-wing agenda?
Yeah, I mean, Israel is a very democratic society. It's a vibrant democracy if you're Jewish. You know, that's true. But the Arab population, whether they're Palestinian citizens of Israel or, of course, the occupied territories, is simply not part of that,
Yeah, sure, I
that game
understand
at
that.
all.
Yeah.
And they don't go to the demonstrations. Palestinian citizens of Israel don't go to the demonstrations.
Right.
So the war, if I can just show you in 1 second, the kind of the debate, the civil war, whatever you want to call it, is kind of between two Israels. This is what a little bit what Arthur was alluding to. One of them is the ones that think that Israel is a self-contained liberal democracy. They represent what Ilan Pappé calls, as a term of Ilan's, fantasy Israel. There's a fantasy Israel that they live in. That's a liberal democracy. We share values with the West. We're a Western country, all that stuff. And that's because it is that kind of a country for them. You see,
It's not a fantasy for them.
It's not a fantasy for them.
Right.
Versus, and this is the side we began to talk about, what we do call in Israel the state of Judah. And this is a flag. This is actually the flag that the settlers have. This is
Who
the
has, Jeff?
state.
It's the flag that who has?
The settlers, the right-wing settlers, the religious Zionists, you know, want to set up what they call the state of Judah, because they don't want, you see, that I was going to go back to that, what you asked before. They don't really want a democracy. We're not really fighting about a democracy. What the right wing wants is a nationalist theocracy. They want a Jewish state that's defined in terms of exclusivity, a religious state, because they're all religious, the settlers, and those are the right, and more those are the Likud as well, even though Netanyahu is secular. And in a sense, they want to transform Israel into the state of Judah.
And that includes the West Bank, correct? Their vision.
Yeah, of course, it includes the West Bank. The West Bank is the heart of it all.
Yeah.
So the liberal Democrats, the liberals that are demonstrating in fantasy Israel, you know, cut off the West Bank and Gaza. They just deal with Israel within this 1967 borders, whereas the state of Judah people, who are supporting the reforms and pushing the reforms, they're in a way the state of Judah people. And they have in other words, it goes well beyond democracy. There's a whole different conception of what this country is all about and what the values are. And what's interesting is, you know, we usually talk about how Israel is annexing or wants to annex the settlements. What in fact is happening today is that the settlements are annexing Israel.
Jeff, let me ask you, I agree with your description that neither kind of Israel is a democracy, and yet I would find myself still in strong support of the non-democracy liberals than the non-democracy religious fascists, whatever you want to call them. And as a result, there's no way I would consider myself neutral between the two. And if I were in Israel, I would therefore go to demonstrations to support the side that I prefer. Just as, you know, in democracies, we often get to choose between two sides that we don't really like and choose the one we prefer. But are you saying that you're really neutral between the two?
No, I'm against both sides. I'm not exactly the typical Israeli that you want to be talking to understand everything. Because,
No,
you know,
I want to
obviously,
hear your
I'm against the
rationale.
fascist side, obviously, but I'm also against the other side. Don't forget this liberal democracy does not, it exists again if you're Jewish, but it doesn't exist as a state. This is a state, an apartheid state, a colonial state, an oppressive state. Don't forget the conquest of the country and the conquest of the occupied territories was done by the liberal Democrats, by the Labor Party, the socialists. The settlements were built by
So,
the socialists. The whole system
so,
of oppression was built by them, the good side, not the bad side.
well,
So
I
you
know
have to be
that.
against both sides in a sense.
So would you say that, which I think is more to the point than who I would demonstrate for, but life for Palestinians will not change regardless of which side is in power?
No, no, because the liberal Democrats, you see what I have on this figure or whatever diagram. See, the liberal Democrats want the fantasy Israel wants a liberal democracy, but you see underneath, with or without an occupation. So for them, it doesn't matter. That's where they're different. They would probably welcome two states. They would do that. But if we do have an occupation that we've had for 50 some years, many of those years with the Labor government, they would also live with that. In other words, they really don't care about Arabs, Palestinians, the wider picture. They just care about themselves. And I'm not part of that little internal, this is an internal Israeli Jewish kind of a thing. And I'm looking at a country where the Jews are a minority in from the river to the sea. 52% of the population is Palestinian. So I can't disconnect from that majority and simply get involved in the internal discussions between Jews about what kind of liberal democracy and apartheid state are we going to have.
But
It's that's
can I
not
repeat my question? Can I repeat my question though, is how will things change for Palestinians, both in Israel and in the territories, if this judicial coup side of the government is in complete control? Do you think nothing significant will change, or do you think there's, what do you think?
Well, it'll make it, first of all, it'll make it easier for the right wing to do what it wants to do. In other words, the Supreme Court, in a way, looks at international law. There is the 14th Convention. There's laws, international laws that constrain occupying powers. One concern that the liberals bring up is that if you nullify the Supreme Court and there's no real fair judicial system, that exposes Israeli soldiers to being brought up on war crimes before in the Hague, in the International Court of Justice, because you could bring them up on war crimes if you're coming from a country that doesn't have a functioning judiciary. So you have that. But I mean, I wouldn't like to live in that state. I certainly don't like the religious, theological people and the settlers and all that. But it wouldn't really be, I think, an essentially different state than it is today. Don't forget today, Bezalel Smotrich, who's a violent settler, is basically the governor of the West Bank. So he's managed. The Supreme Court also hasn't been great in terms of the Supreme Court, from the right wing point of view, has put constraints. For example, Israel wanted to deport 40,000 African asylum seekers, which is against the law. It wanted to send them back to Africa. And the Supreme Court said, no, you can't do that because there are international conventions about asylum seekers. So that's something they could do if they can nullify the Supreme Court. But in terms of Palestinians, I mean, in today's situation, we have a situation where Smotrich is the governor of the West Bank, and he's just issued instructions that there's no more planning restrictions anymore on settlements. The government doesn't have to approve settlements anymore. They can simply be built. So from the point of view that I'm concerned with, the whole country, including Jews and Palestinians, it doesn't really matter from my point of view which way it goes.
Jeff, I'm gonna ask, first I'm gonna ask you and Arthur to please, I did advertise this as a discussion about what's happening inside Israel, and I know they can't help skewing it back to the consequences of the Palestinians, but I'd like to answer a couple of nuts and bolts questions that have come up in the Q&A. One is, can you remind us why it is that Israel doesn't have a constitution? There's reasons for that, and just a very short answer, Jeff, and why Israel.
Well, one of the main reasons is that there was no the socialist secular Zionists that founded the state, Ben Gurion, and the Labor Party couldn't get into an agreement with the religious, because for the religious Jews, the religious Zionists, the Talmud is the constitution. You can't have a secular constitution that trumps, to use a contemporary term, that trumps Jewish law. And therefore, the compromise was there'll be no constitution, the Supreme Court, and there'll be secular laws that run a lot of society, but everything in Israel that has to do with civil status, marriage, death, divorce, inheritance, all of that is in religious courts. So we have a religious court system. You don't have civil marriage in Israel, for example. So you have so that was the deal. The religious would take over the domestic life of people that didn't really interest Ben Gurion, and the government would take over the rest, but there'd be no constitution because the religious couldn't accept the authority of a constitution over religious law.
Okay, that's very helpful. My understanding as well is that Israel has this Declaration of Independence that talked about equality and so on and so forth, but that never got incorporated into a basic law because there was a policy that didn't want to treat the Palestinians equally inside the country. Is that your understanding as well?
Yeah, I mean, it has the same internal contradictions that Zionism does.
Right.
This is a Jewish country, and it's our country, and we have a right to it. But everybody living here, in other words, what it does is it recognizes Arabs. We don't talk about Palestinians, Arab citizens of Israel as citizens with equal civil rights, but it doesn't give them the national rights. That, in other words, I have national rights here in my country, and civil rights. A Palestinian citizen of Israel only has civil rights. They're not recognized as a national group with national rights.
Okay. Another question that came up, I thought, was sort of nuts and bolts. If the right, what is in the, give us a couple of examples of the kinds of things that the Netanyahu, Smotrich, so an agenda would, if they were given free hand, what kinds of laws or programs would they introduce? Maybe that'll help us understand why so many secular Israelis are upset by it.
Well, I mean, the most immediate thing, and this is another almost a real reason why the reforms are going through, is Netanyahu's trial. Netanyahu's being tried for fraud, and he's got 3 different trials going on. He's completely obsessed with that, and he wants to change the system. And this is basic to the idea where the government appoints the judges. You see, today judges are appointed by a panel that includes the Lawyers Guild and public figures or public representatives and members of the parliament. So he wants to do away. One of the main things is he wants to do away with that and have the government appoint judges. So one of the reasons is, of course, when he appeals, he'll be able to get out of his problems. But there's a lot of corruption in Israel, and so basically the corrupted, like the religious parties, Deri, for example, who according to the law has been barred from being a member of the cabinet. This guy Deri, who's from the Shas party, religious Zionist party. Because he's been convicted twice of fraud and been in jail, so he can't serve the government minister. Well, they want to pass a special law that says no, he can. Well, the Supreme Court's standing in the way of that. You see, in other words, that they can pass any law that they want to pass that gives them a free hand. One of the things Netanyahu's under trial for is that he took, I mean, hundreds of thousands of dollars in gifts from rich people in order to promote their agendas and so on. Well, now they're trying to pass a law that says there is no limit on the amount of gifts that a political figure can accept. I mean, that's completely an invitation to corruption. The Supreme Court won't allow it, and therefore you've got to nullify the ability. One of the basic laws they want to get through is that any decision of the Supreme Court, any ruling of the Supreme Court, can be overruled by the Parliament with a simple majority of one, not any super majority, just a majority of one. And so they can pass any law they want. If they get in trouble with the law, they can pass laws that get them out of trouble. It's basically what the left is saying, what the liberals are saying. It's really the opening to a dictatorship. It's a dictatorship of whoever's running the parliament, whichever coalition.
I've read that a large part of the opposition to the coalition comes from people who don't want to see religious restrictions on their activities. Is that a major thing, do you think?
No, that's a huge thing. That's a huge thing. We don't have here transportation on Shabbat, which really hurts the poorer people, and so on. There's a lot of religious.
Jeff, let me just jump in there, because that's so obvious to you and to Arthur, but maybe you don't realize it means that from Friday sundown, Friday afternoon or whatever, there's no light rail. We don't have any light rail at all in Ottawa anymore because it doesn't work. But the one in Jerusalem, when it works very well, but it doesn't work from Friday 4 o'clock to Saturday sometime.
Or buses
or trains, or that's one example of the kind of religious restrictions that are imposed on secular Israelis because the religious parties want it. Am I right there?
Yeah, but I mean, more importantly, the religious want to dictate the agenda in schools. And take out anything that has to. Just this week, the parent circle, which is this bereaved parent circle, bereaved parents, Israeli Jews and Palestinians together, have been banned from the public schools. They're not allowed to come in anymore. So there's a religious agenda and a nationalist agenda as well, of taking over the schools, all kinds of restrictions also on in finance. I won't get into all of that. But the whole idea that Israel would become the state of Judah, would become a theocracy, is something that's really scary especially because the majority of Israelis identify as either religious or traditional. So secular Israelis are a minority today. We talk about the Republic of Tel Aviv. So that's true, Arthur. That's a real fear that there'll be a theocracy and that restaurants will close on Shabbat. You won't be able to have non-kosher food. I mean, there'll be restrictions, especially LGBTQ communities, all kinds of gender issues, of course.
What's their agenda for women?
All of those to be rolled back. And if you go back to Jewish law, the woman's in the home. The religious now have a big campaign of trying to ban abortion. I mean, it's very similar to what the right wing is doing, in your countries as well. So that them being the majority in parliament and not having any judicial constraints then would allow them to just dictate all of that. They can legislate it, and there's no pushback. There's no way, for a liberal society to defend itself.
What do you think the chances are of restoration of the pre-coalition government?
I mean, that gets back to the problem that we were talking about before. I think people are tired of Netanyahu, and he's lost a lot of support because most people don't support these judicial reforms, including a quarter of his own party. So it could be that you'll get a non-Likud government next time, like you just had with Bennett and Lapid. You had a government without the ultra-Orthodox and without the Likud. But it was a super right-wing government. It's true, a Labour Party was in there, Meretz was in there, but they had no real power. But Bennett is the head of the religious settler party. Ayelet Shaked, who was the justice minister, is the representative of the Federalist Society in Israel. She's the one that put in very conservative judges when she was the minister of justice here. So that even if it's a non-Likud government, look, what we call let's say the liberal left, the progressives, are gone in Israel. There is no more Labor Party. They have 4 seats today out of 120 in the parliament, and all the polls will say they'll disappear in the next election. Meretz, the other left-wing Zionist party, is gone. They're not in the parliament at all. So the most liberal progressive party in Israel is Yair Lapid, who comes out of the Likud. He's a Likudnik, but he represents the yuppies in Tel Aviv. So that you'll get a kind of a Likud light. But they're all committed to the occupation. They're all committed to settlements. They're all committed to a greater Israel. They're against, what is true, the big difference is that they're against religious coercion. So that's why Lapid and Gantz, that are leading now those more liberal, center liberal forces, are so active, because this really is more a fear of religious coercion coming from the right than it is anything political from our point of view, occupation or things like that. Those aren't issues.
Jeff, there was recently there was the vote in the Knesset 64-0 was over the reasonableness clause. What, just practically, what kinds of laws had been adopted and that the Supreme Court had actually said, no, those are not reasonable, and that the current government would like to see passed or taken? Can you give an example or two?
Well, and this idea of reasonableness, again, fills in a gap because you don't have a constitution. So the court has had to decide case by case, what fits within the basic laws or not. I mean, I just gave you an example a little while ago of the asylum seekers.
Mm.
They're protected because Israel is a signatory on international law, and part of the basic laws is that Israel, in order to get independence, had to agree to abide by UN resolutions. Israel, is a part of the international community. So if that's all neutralized, or even if it remains on the books, but in fact the parliament can overrule the Supreme Court by a simple majority, then all those then the government can do it. It can thumb its nose at international law. So there's no protections from that point of view. In other words, it's true, it's a kind of a dictatorship. Whatever the government wants goes. There's no judicial constraint in any way, in any sense.
Jeff, Arthur, I was going to ask one technical question, if you don't mind. Someone has asked, and I think it's, you referred to the distinction between civil rights and national rights, and that's not clear to Canadians. We think of, where Canadians, you have civil rights and citizenship rights. That requires just a very short explanation of the difference between citizenship rights and national rights, which in Israel are different.
Well, if you would say Canadian democracy is, I don't know how you'd phrase it, British, it's British Canadian. We're a part of the Commonwealth. It's British Canadian democracy. So that this is our country. We have the flag. This is a British English speaking Canada, and we have all the civil rights, and it's our country, and it's our flag. And everybody that isn't English speaking and white can have their civil rights. They can be citizens of Canada, but they can't be prime minister. They can't, in other words, they don't have national rights. They can't have their own flag. They can't have any self-determination. They have to simply live. They'll have citizenship, but we make the laws. It's our country. We distribute the land and everything else. And so, it's a second-class citizenship.
The example that I've found the most compelling and that clear was from Jonathan Cook, that a lot of the land is specifically held for Jews. So Palestinian citizens of Israel can live in Israel, but they can't live in certain areas of the country because that's a national right for Jews.
94% of the land of Israel is reserved exclusively for Jews because it's a Jewish country and the state is custodian of the land for the Jews. In other words, the country belongs. Let me just say one thing real quick. There's two kinds of nationalisms without getting into a lecture. Where you come from, you, the US, Western Europe, your form of democracy, it comes out of the American Revolution, it comes out of the French Revolution, is the concept of a citizen. And a citizen belongs to the state, and the state belongs to its citizens. And you can become a citizen. You can immigrate from wherever you want to. You can become a Canadian, right, with all the rights, and because the state belongs to its citizens. Zionism comes out, don't forget, the Jews all lived, 90% of the Jews before World War II lived in the Ukraine or Belarus or Poland, Eastern Europe and Russia and Germany. Germany Central Europe was the same thing with the Nazis and so on. And there, the form of nationalism was what we call ethno-nationalism, tribal nationalism. Russia belongs to Russians. Hungary, you can see it today with Orban. Hungary belongs to Hungarians. Poland belongs to Poles. It doesn't belong to its citizens. And one reason why Jews were persecuted so much was they and the Roma, the Gypsies, the Roma, were really the only two minority groups in Europe. So they didn't fit in. But so in other words, and so what Israel did is import that, so that Israel's not a country. You see, Israel tries to present itself as a Western democracy. And it's true, Arabs in Israel have citizenship, but it's second-class citizenship. So the whole idea of a country belonging to one particular group, that's foreign to Canadians. I mean, as a matter of fact, that's racist. That's undemocratic. That couldn't be. But that is taken for granted in Israel because they have this concept coming from Eastern Europe that yes, a country, one particular group, a nation state, every nation has its territory. It belongs exclusively to that nation, and you try as much as possible to ethnically cleanse it. So what Israel's done here is the same thing that Hungary does, and Poland does, and Russia does, and the Ukraine. So it's a very different conception of what a state is. And of course, and in terms of democracy, Orban, wait one second, Orban has the best term. Orban says Hungary is an illiberal democracy. That's his term.
I mean, I would say many of those examples, like ownership of land, are definitely crossing into civil rights rather than national rights. To say only Jews have the right to 96% of the land, that's not civil rights. Those are, it's not to say that individual Palestinians have civil rights when they can't live in 96% of the land. I would think that things like linguistic rights more have to do with national rights. Every country in the world limits linguistic rights to certain languages. So the question in Israel would be, do Palestinians have national rights to universities and education? What are the linguistic rights of Arabic in Israel? And that's, for me, that kind of thing comes into national right. Which national holidays do you celebrate, right? In Canada, we're now pretending kind of to celebrate some non-Christian holidays, but we don't really. Canada's a Christian country, but the preferences for Christianity are pretty limited. Whereas in Israel, there's much greater preferences, I think, for the rights of Jews. But to me, that would be national rights. Can I ask you, the opposite of the question is, can the pre-coalition situation be restored? Would be, one sees more predictions than ever of a kind of failed state in Israel, or a rise of fascism, of outright fascism in Israel, the end of democratic elections, even among Jews, the end of the Jewish democracy. Do you think that's possible? Civil war, is that possible?
I don't know if that's, I don't think it goes that far. I think you can't underestimate kind of the solidarity of Jews. I mean, the idea of Jews fighting other Jews isn't really accepted. So I don't think it would go that far.
But you do see these pictures of Jewish policemen beaten up, or water guns. I mean, there's quite remarkable violence that has been used about the Palestinians is now being used, at least occasionally, against Jewish protesters.
No, that's right. But they're being tried now, those policemen. I mean, there was a lot of shock. There was a lot of shock about that. You don't do that to Jewish protesters. You do it to Arabs. In some ways, you can even do it to the ultra-Orthodox, but you don't do it to mainstream trade. No, I think, look, fascism is Israel is a fascist state in a sense. I mean, you can't set up a state. I mean, fascism is built into ethno-nationalism. That's what fascism really is. Nazism wasn't some foreign thing that was imposed on Germany. It kind of came out of a lot of German tradition. And the same is true here. When Zionism came here and said, we're setting up a state for Jews, and it's only for Jews, and we're the only real citizens, we're the only real nation, and everybody else is a criminal or a terrorist or has to be out of here or whatever, you set up an intolerant regime, an illiberal democracy or an illiberal whatever it is, because you can't be liberal. You can't offer equal rights to people and protect and even talk about their human, civil, national rights and still assert that this state belongs to us and not to you. So it's built in. I don't think Israel has to go to fascism. I think it's already there, but it's a fascism that's still controlled by the Supreme Court and laws, and it's still controlled to some degree by, it's true, this idea of these liberal Israelis that somehow we're a part of the Western world, we're a part of Europe, and trying to be like that, trying to sort of be liberal. So what that means is you ignore everything that's going on. If I go out and talk about the occupation of the street, or Palestinian, even use the word Palestinian, people don't know what the hell I'm talking about. It's a non-issue. It's like I'm going out on the street and arguing about the problems in the Congo, or it's so distant from Israelis. So that in a way, the fascism is there, but it's held at bay by the fact that we all play this democratic game, the right and the left, because it only deals with Jews. So the minute you scratch that, the fascism comes out.
So Jeff,
even on the left.
On that basis, these stories about Jewish doctors, Israeli doctors saying what they want to emigrate or rise in application for foreign passports and so on, is that true? Or is it just a tiny phenomenon that the newspapers have picked up and made a huge deal of? Or if it is true, what are they afraid of? What would be behind this?
Well, I mean, it's partly true. I was trying to find the newspaper from today. The caricature, the political caricature in the paper today is a plane load of passengers, and the stewardess is saying, "Is there a doctor on the plane?" And everybody's raising their hand. so plain as doctors. Look, what's happened is Israel has been routinized over the years. It's been normalized. And again, for most people, Palestinians don't really matter. So that they're looking at Israel as a kind of the United States or Canada, a Western or European country. And to the degree, what bothers them is the religious, especially. So if it becomes a theocracy and they feel their rights are, and then there's a right wing and they're trying to put flags in every classroom and they're trying to make everybody nationalist and we're becoming a kind of pariah state in the world. Yeah, see the hell with that. I don't want that for myself. And middle class people have the wherewithal to get out. So I'll be a doctor in Canada. I'll go, I can get out.
What would,
And
what
so I
would,
think that's
what would push you to leave?
not
anything?
political. It's the personal threat of the right wing and religious stuff here. It's not political. It's my own personal status that matters.
So can I ask this, to go back to Palestinians? If we are concerned about the Palestinians, there seems to be talk of greater potential for violence, greater anti-Palestinian violence, and more likelihood of expulsions and more extreme measures.
That's right.
Are you saying, no, nothing really is changing and we shouldn't worry about those things any more than we have been?
Yeah. I mean, it's like I said, in terms of just the Palestinian, the occupation, which is not in anybody's mind here, when we're dealing with this issue, again, even if a Bennett government was super, Bennett, Gantz, Lapid, they're Likud, they're super committed to settlements and so on. And again, the Labour Party, in Oslo, the golden age, where he's shaking hands, negotiating with the Palestinians, everything. It also began in 1993 with Rabin in Paris. There was no Begin, there was no Netanyahu. There was even no religious. This was a government completely of two parties, Labor and Meretz, a left-wing party.
I understand.
1993, in 1993, when Oslo began, there were 200,000 settlers. 7 years later, when Oslo ended, there were 400,000 settlers. That was Labor. That wasn't the Likud. So I don't really see.
It seems to me that you're saying to those of us who have been active in one way or another in fighting for Palestinian rights, that you're saying, don't worry, what's going on now in Israel doesn't make any difference.
No, it doesn't, because Israel's a settler colonial state that wants to take over Palestine, and that was the Labor. Labor founded Zionism. Labor. I mean, you're looking at Labor as somehow some kind of a liberal thing that's against occupation, that's against settlements, that wants peace, that wants some kind of. They're the ones that built this whole thing. It's their ideology. It's their agenda.
But
that's what.
But Jeff, I can imagine things getting a lot worse. I can imagine things getting a lot worse, and you seem to be saying, don't worry about that.
No, I'm not saying don't worry. I'm saying don't have an illusion that if a non-Likud government comes to power, it's going to be any better. I mean, Bennett's government was just as bad as Netanyahu's government. It was more honest, maybe, but in terms of policies, and that's why I'm pushing. It's not a conversation for tonight. I'm saying we have to replace Israel with one democratic country of equal rights for everybody here. You can't reform Zionism. You can't reform an apartheid state. You've got to replace apartheid and all of that with something new. And that's what I'm saying. So from my point of view, whatever side wins, one side might be more liberal, might make things a little nicer for me. In terms of the wider country and what Israel really is, that doesn't matter to most Israelis, again, which is true. I mean, what you're saying is true for Israelis. Most Israelis, they would say, yes, we don't want these reforms. Things will be much better for us with the Supreme Court, and we hold the religious at bay and all this corruption, all this other stuff. Definitely. But if you take the bigger picture, what I'm saying is Israel is Israel, and you're going to have the same policies unless you replace it with a new policy, a democratic state in the whole country for everybody.
Jeff, we're getting in near the end of our time. You've been generous with your time. It's now midnight for you in Jerusalem. If we are talking about this, like, what do you think is going to happen? Where's this going to go? Is Israel going to evolve? Yeah, when I read that the right wing, the religious parties, of course, have more babies. The secular folks, some of them are leaving. Is Israel the balance going to turn so Israel does become that theocratic right wing society, or are things going to reverse? People come to quote their senses or whatever phraseology would. How do you think things are going to evolve? And then I'm going to ask you, what do you think are the consequences for the Palestinians? But first of all, how do you think things are going to evolve over the next 12 months?
It's going to go more right wing. I mean, there's been a lot of research. The young generation in Israel is more right wing than its parents were. The OECD, this 28 countries with the most advanced economies in the world, did a survey, and they found that this is Europe and North America, Japan, the 28 most advanced economies in the world, in China and so on. Of all the countries in the OECD, Israeli young people were the most right wing of any population except Hungary. Hungary was the worst. So in fact, I think that's one reason why a lot of the liberals in Tel Aviv, when we talk about the Republic of Tel Aviv, we're really talking about a little enclave. Tel Aviv is kind of an enclave today, and as that enclave becomes more besieged and people are beginning to feel the country's becoming more illiberal, again, they have the ability to leave. So I think the fact that they're leaving and I think young people are becoming right wing for the same things that I'm not getting into, but I talked about before, because the very logic, the very life of a settler colonial country, when you come in to take over another people and somebody else's country, you're always insecure. You're always looking over your shoulder. You can never relax. You can never settle into your country because you've got 51% of the population that's not included. That's in a way your enemy. That has to be your enemy. That's resisting you, and all that. And then the militarism, and you go into the army, and you go into, all of that stuff. It just creates a reality where people become right wing. They become nationalistic today. They're becoming more and more religious. It's certainly not a recipe for people becoming liberal, progressive people. So those liberals and progressives that are still here, it's true, are leaving, or they're kind of, they're trying to hunker in Tel Aviv and protect what they have. But
do you see
the tendency here is not going in their favor.
Do you see a state in which you're going to be at risk personally? I mean, there are lots of people. Smochek doesn't like you very much.
That's what I'm saying. I'm not at risk at all.
Yeah.
I'm saying there's no civil war thing.
Yeah.
No, I'm fine. Nobody's going to bother me. I can be a Trotskyist. I can get up in the street and yell I'm an anti-Zionist. It's no problem for me because I'm Jewish. There's no. I don't think there's any issues here of my civil rights. I mean, there's an issue in that they'll make the education of my kids worse. They'll make my kids right wing. They'll start to impact. One of the issues again we didn't talk about with judicial reform is that all the economists are saying if this goes through, the Israeli economy could collapse. Its credit ratings could be degraded, because nobody's going to invest in a country with high tech, and even though with the high tech and everything, that has an unstable, investors don't have a stable legal system that protects their investments.
Right.
So, and that's one of the things I think that's leading a lot of these people to leave. The high-tech people don't want to stay here because nobody's investing in high-tech here anymore from abroad like they used to. So they're going abroad to work. So I think that's the issue there. Again, like I said, the problem is personal. Can I really make a good living here? Can I start a business here? Can my kids be free? And can I be secular? Can I be free of religious coercion? All of that stuff. Forget Palestinians, everything else. Can I do that? And if I can't do that, I'll go to Canada. I can go to Canada. Why not? You see, I think that's really the issue. That's pushing people out.
Jeff, we're going to wind up there. It's 5 o'clock. I have a couple of things. Show us again the cover of your book. So I will put a link to the name of the book in the follow-up email afterward. You haven't got your book. There you go. Okay. You got to hold it in front of the camera. There you go.
Yeah.
Liberating Palestine. I saw in the chat a number of people have read it. Thank you. Thank you very much for that. I noticed in the chat someone picked up on your notion of one democratic state, and they asked, is it realistic? And the next OFIP webinar is going to be with Gabe Karmi, who has written a book called One State, the Only Democratic Future for Israel Palestine. And I'm going to be quizzing her specifically, not on whether or not it's a good idea, which a lot of progressive people think, but whether or not it's realistic. What would have to happen for it to be able to be considered? And so I'll cross-examine her on that and see if she has a. It's one I hear often. That's a wonderful idea, but it's not going to work. And just drop it there. So that'll be for the next webinar. In the meantime, Arthur Miller.
Realistic.
Pardon?
Very realistic, but how to get there is a whole other webinar.
Okay, fair enough. Well, we'll have you on that at some point as well, Jeff. Arthur, any final words to leave the audience with here?
No, thanks. Thank you. Thanks, Jeff.
Okay, thanks you for having me. I hope this wasn't too much of a downer.
No, I think I think it's valuable for us to have a concrete understanding of the contradictions inside Israeli society, and I think you've helped us do that. It obviously has huge implications for the Palestinians, but it's an extraordinary time in Israel. These huge demonstrations, people feeling very strongly about different points of view, and I think it's important for us all to understand it. So. Thank you so much. I tried to incorporate as many questions as I could from the Q&A. And thank you very much and have a good evening.
Okay, thanks for having me.
Good, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, Peter. Thanks, Arthur.
Bye-bye.
Everyone.